Hey everyone, welcome back to the Flutter Bloc series. Today, we're diving into something a bit more advanced, handling multiple states using Bloc. Imagine you're building an app that fetches data from an API, like weather data. You need to handle multiple states, loading, success, and error all at once, right? Well, I've got you covered. By the end of this episode, you'll know how to set up Bloc to handle different states and update your UI dynamically depending on what's happening behind the scenes. Alright, first things first, let's define our states. I'll be using a weather app example here, but you can adapt this to any kind of app, whether you're fetching data from an API, loading images, or processing input. As you can see, we've created 3 states. Weather loading, when the app is fetching the data. Weather loaded, when we successfully get the weather data. Weather error, in case something goes wrong, like a network error. Each state is going to represent a different phase in our app. Now let's move on to the events. Next up are events. Events are what trigger the state changes. In our case, we'll use one event, fetch weather event, which will pass along the city name that the user enters. Whenever the user types in a city name and taps the button, this event is going to fire off, and our Bloc will handle it. We're halfway there. Now let's set up our Bloc to manage these states. When using Bloc in Flutter, the Emit method is preferred over Yield in newer versions of the Flutter Bloc package. It's a cleaner and more straightforward approach to emitting new states. Let's go through the process of using the Emit method inside a Bloc with asynchronous state changes using Future. Here's an example where we implement a weather app Bloc using the Emit method instead of Yield. The basic flow is the same, but now we use Emit to transition between states. Initial state, weather initial. When the weather block is first created, the initial state is weather initial. Event handler, on fetch weather event. We use the on fetch weather event method to register a handler for the fetch weather event. This handler runs when the event is dispatched. Inside the event handler, we mark it as async because we'll be dealing with asynchronous code like API calls. Emit method, instead of using Yield, we use Emit to transition between states. First, we emit the weather loading state to show the loading indicator. After simulating a network request, we emit the weather loaded state, passing the weather information. If there's an error, we emit the weather error state. Let's practically implement it. For immediate create Bloc file, download Bloc extension. The state represents the different conditions our app can be in. These include loading, success, weather data loaded, and error, something went wrong. Weather state is an abstract class from which all other states inherit. Weather initial is the starting state, where no data has been fetched. Weather loading shows a loading state when the weather data is being fetched. Weather loaded contains the actual weather information. Weather error holds an error message in case fetching the weather data fails. Whenever the user types in a city name and taps the button, this event is going to fire off, and our Bloc will handle it. We're halfway there. Now let's set up our Bloc to manage these states. Initial state, weather initial. When the weather block is first created, the initial state is weather initial. Event handler, on fetch weather event. We use the on fetch weather event method to register a handler for the fetch weather event. This handler runs when the event is dispatched. Inside the event handler, we mark it as async because we'll be dealing with asynchronous code like API calls. Emit method, instead of using Yield, we use Emit to transition between states. First, we emit the weather loading state to show the loading indicator. After simulating a network request, we emit the weather loaded state, passing the weather information. If there's an error, we emit the weather error state. Next, let's connect our Bloc to the UI. We'll use a block builder to listen for state changes and update the UI accordingly. Let's write that code. Let's run this. When we enter a city and press the button, you'll first see a loading spinner. After 2 seconds, the weather data will show up. And if something goes wrong, we'll display an error message. Now, you might be wondering, why should I bother with this? Why not just use basic setState to change my UI? Well, as your app grows, using simple setState for everything can quickly turn into a nightmare. You end up mixing logic with UI, and debugging becomes hard. Bloc helps you keep things separate. Your business logic lives in the block, and your UI just responds to state changes. It's a clean, structured approach that makes your app more scalable. Imagine an app where you have loading screens, error pop-ups, and success messages spread across different screens or widgets. Without Bloc, you'd have to manage all those transitions manually. With Bloc, the state itself determines what the UI should do, whether to show a spinner, display the data, or handle an error. You don't need to think about it every time. Now that we've gone through the entire flow, from states and events to Bloc and UI, all that's left is to tie it together in main.dart. As you've seen, this is where we bring everything to life. Once you have this set up, adding more features or states becomes much easier because of how structured the app is. In the next episode, we'll explore data persistence with Bloc so that even when you restart the app, the state is saved. We'll also dig deeper into more advanced Bloc patterns and error handling. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on the upcoming episodes. See you next time.